The devastating news is that all the patients in Al-Shifa hospital have been killed, or they've died, but they essentially have been killed, all 54 of them in the ICU. Now, this has been a story for many days. Israel's occupation of this hospital, its bombardment. I'll just pull up a video of some of the most, I think, heinous activity. I'll show the video of them literally planting a flag on this hospital as if they are essentially colonizing a hospital. So here it is. So there is that. And of course, the propaganda around this has been, or the misinformation, so to speak, is that Hamas is hiding under the hospital. And there have been a lot of so-called imagery supposedly proving this from the Israeli offense occupation forces. And let me just show you one, and then I'll kick it to you, Lowkey, for your reaction to this. Let me just pull it up here. So here is the video that the IDF published, supposedly claiming that there's a tunnel underneath the hospital. It is essentially just a video of a hole, but it gets stranger. And as, of course, the misinformation, the propaganda has gone incredibly strange, as you can see here. Guns, supposedly. We can see those. This is what they've been claiming. I mean, the propaganda has been intense. Your reaction to all of this, Lowkey?
Well, my understanding is that it is all of the ICU patients in Al-Shifa hospital that have died. There's a myriad of ways in which that may have happened. This is an area that has been deprived of fuel for over a month now. You are talking about people that would have needed dialysis for kidney problems. You are talking about babies on incubators. You are talking about really the most desperate people in this situation. Many of them will have died of dehydration. There has been no water allowed into Gaza across these days. And in fact, we know of the Israeli military taking bottles of water from the basement of Al-Shifa hospital and repackaging it as Israeli aid and giving it to people in there. We know of examples where people have tried to exit the hospital waving white flags and been shot at. And things like this are happening across the north of Gaza. Israel defines itself really by this activity. It picks on the weakest and most vulnerable in any community. And in this case, the community is the Palestinians. We are seeing them being targeted in this way. They're not able to engage in urban warfare in an effective manner. Israel has proven that when it attempts to engage with Palestinian fighters street to street, hand to hand, it loses tanks. But, you know, it's believed almost 100 Israeli military vehicles, as far as I understand from the last check, have been destroyed in their attempt to subjugate Gaza. And so what that means is that Israel then relies on the drones, on the F-16s, on the F-35s to bomb from above and attack civilian infrastructure, attack places of worship, attack hospitals, as is the case of Al-Shifa. And Israel, of course, you know, this hospital goes back to the British Mandate of Palestine. It originally became a health facility in 1946, and it's passed through different administrations over that time. Of course, we know that Gaza was officially part under Egyptian authority until 1967. And Israeli occupation forces in 1983 are believed to have built a bunker underneath the hospital. So for some time, the claim was that ultimately, if the Israelis do find a bunker, they would know because they built it in the first place. But what we've seen, interestingly, in the last day or so, Israel put out a video of its soldiers supposedly finding weapons, an AK-47 to be precise, in the MRI room of Al-Shifa hospital. Now, the BBC came up and said when the video was released, Israel found two weapons in the MRI room. And then when the BBC turned up to be led around the hospital, actually Israel was able to produce four weapons that had been found in the MRI room. And the BBC took some issue with this, saying they weren't sure if this was necessarily reliable, because it seemed that in Israel's supposedly unedited video, which it turned out Israel had edited, there had only been two weapons. But then you have the testimony of a British doctor on Twitter who has just come out and is, his intervention is important in this equation. His name is Adil Hamad. And he has said, this was a British doctor who, up until a few weeks ago, as far as I understand, was working in Al-Shifa hospital. And he has said that the MRI machine contains a magnet, which would mean that the storing of any metal objects in an MRI room, especially guns, would be completely unrealistic, because essentially the magnet would bring the guns towards it, and any metal items would be sucked towards those weapons. So this is another in a long line, a litany of Israel's lies to justify a genocidal war, in the name of battling a non-state actor. Israel's war on a concentration camp consists largely of bombing civilian targets. And what has also come out is the extent to which the United States is helping Israel. Not only do you have the Delta Force on the ground, key US Special Operations Unit, what you also have is the United States offering transporting weapons daily across this last month from a British military base in Cyprus. Now, this is a serious level of complicity that we are talking about with what has happened. And that's the reason that you have people like Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah talking clearly about this as a US war. This is a US war against the region. And Biden has backed Israel in ways that no previous US presidents have. So I think all of those who have gone out of their way to try and beautify the image of the Democrats across these years really have to eat humble pie, because what Joe Biden has shown you is he is equally as racist as Donald Trump in terms of what is the substance of his actions. And of course, I looked at the funding of Israel lobbyists to US members of Congress across the last 30 or 40 years. And actually, the Democrats have received almost twice as much from Israel lobbyists as the Republicans have. So we're talking about major levels of complicity of both Britain and the United States. Really, a trilateral security state has been established between Britain, the United States, and Israel. And this war is one manifestation of that.
Yeah, no, the Democratic Party funding is very targeted too, because Israel is quite aware, the Israel lobby is quite aware just who votes Democrat, just which demographics kind of need to be pushed in Israel's direction. The Republicans are taken. They are all in, but it's Democratic Party voters that have a little bit of trouble. So Democratic Party politicians are very valuable to the Israel lobby. So, given this, I wanted your take on, there have been reports, and we've seen we've seen the Western media kind of, especially when talking to Netanyahu, express some dismay about the civilian casualties. I think that the protests, a lot of the journalism that's been done independently, is starting to have an effect. However, as you said, I mean, the Biden administration is not only doing everything that you said it's doing, but it's many ways it's doing it secretly. It's not as open as it has been around, say, Ukraine. So what do you make of this contradiction between the United States under Biden all in on Israel's brutal genocide in Gaza, while also there's this kind of more public walking a line of Israel needs total support, but at the same time, it's not looking too good that there are videos everywhere showing just the absolute horror that's taking place at the hands of Israel.
Well, it's interesting that you mention Ukraine, because there seems to have been certainly a pivot of resources, but not only resources. Actually, it was revealed recently that Israel has European mercenaries fighting with it in Gaza. So Spanish mercenary Pedro Diaz Flores was pictured there with the Israeli occupation forces. Now, who is he? He was an individual that fought in Ukraine, where he got involved through the neo-Nazi Azov battalion. Now, he claimed that his involvement in Ukraine came from messaging the Azov Telegram channel, and then being picked up by Azov and taken to Ukraine, where he was integrated into what they call the Charlie 1 unit of the Ukrainian military intelligence. And he later went on to a unit called Bravo 2. And, you know, when he talks about his time in the Ukrainian military intelligence, he says, there were excellent professionals, mostly Americans, also many Hispanics. I met a Mexican who was also accused of selling human skulls and bones. Now, he has turned up with the Israeli military in Gaza. How many other warlord-like figures who were active in Ukraine have now turned up in Gaza with the Israeli military? What we are seeing is colonialism in 2023. We are seeing the forces of European powers come together to work to subjugate the global south. And Gaza is considered the most south of the global south as of today. Gaza is holding up the sky for the rest of humanity. You have literally the best people in the world, the best of humanity, are now clinging to life in every way they can in Gaza. They are helping children to breathe, literally breath by breath. They are trying to make bread to sustain people's lives. You know, we can't forget that Israel has savagely attacked almost all bakeries in Gaza. And the thing with Israel's campaign to take the north of Gaza so far, you have to remember that around 20 nautical miles off the coast of Gaza, you have huge reserves of gas. And Israel actually signed deals with British Gas Group to develop that area, and was not able to because Gaza was controlled by Hamas. So it was not able to exploit that source of gas. Now, if you are Western powers who are furious with the extent to which sanctions on Russia have not been effective due to these very clear resource wars, then it would make sense for you to support Israel's land grab and also resource grab in Gaza. You also have the possibility of Israel developing a port from the north of Gaza, Ben Gurion Canal, as has been spoken about in the past by several key Zionist thinkers. And this would absolutely change the global economy in massive ways, and would definitely benefit the United States, Gulf allies. It would, of course, harm Egypt and the Suez Canal. It would harm the interests of Iran and others. So there's a myriad of reasons why the United States sees its interests reflected in what Israel is doing in Gaza. And also, interestingly, Israeli political figures have said very clearly that they saw what happened in Yemen in the British-US proxy war, Israeli proxy war against Iran in Yemen, backing of the Saudis, who attacked all manner of civilian infrastructure, who bombed farms over 1,000 times. And also in terms of human suffering, in terms of starvation, in terms of children dying from dehydration. ultimately Israel saw this and saw that our understanding of what the international community is had absolutely no intention to stop or ameliorate any of these issues. And that was perceived to be a green light for the Israelis to engage in this war on Gaza. They saw, in terms of human displacement, what came out of the US war against Daesh, ISIS. They've often mentioned the carpet bombing of Raqqa and of Mosul. They've seen, in terms of human displacement that came out of Syria, and the way in which the quote unquote international community was able to absorb and provide tents for tens of thousands of people. And so they have seen the possibility of moving the Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai Desert. There's been suggestions by Israeli political figures of each country in the world taking maybe a few hundred Palestinians, the different Arab states taking thousands of Palestinians. They've tried to think of ways that they can distribute Palestinians around the world, and Palestinians are the largest refugee population in the world. 1 in 3 refugees in the world is a Palestinian. So Israel is seeking, true to the nature of Zionism as an ideology, it is seeking a maximalist, fantastical aim in terms of what it wants to achieve. All of this is wrapped up in the campaign to demolish and replace Al-Aqsa. And Yusuf al-Kabir, an Iraqi Jewish lawyer in the 1930s, he referred to the Zionist movement as a form of militant archaeology. And that is nowhere more clear than the Temple Mount movement's aims at Al-Aqsa. The Temple Mount movement is funded by both the Israeli Ministry of Education and the Israeli Ministry of Culture, and the Deputy Defense Minister of Israel, when he was in his position, was funding this organization, and US billionaires like Henry Swiker or Simon Falek, who runs Duty Free America. They are funding this movement, which has the stated objective of demolishing the first Qibla in Islam, the direction to which Muslims prayed before it became centered in Mecca. You're talking about a very important place to Muslims around the world that Israel has the intention, the stated purpose of demolishing this compound and replacing it with a temple, which those in the Temple Mount movement believe existed 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Militant archaeology is certainly the word for it. But these are Israel's aims. Key Israeli political figures have written about it historically. The idea of Jordan absorbing the Palestinians in the West Bank, Egypt absorbing the Palestinians in Gaza, and the destruction of Al-Aqsa. So these are the stakes of where we are with this genocidal war. And now the Israelis have said, actually, Hamas are not in North Gaza, they're in the south of Gaza. So we're now going to go into this small area of land that they've forced millions of Palestinians into. And we've identified 4 locations in places like Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza. And now Palestinians have to go even further into the space of Rafah, between the crossing to get into Egypt. So they are pushing the Palestinians, making Gaza as uninhabitable as possible in order to push them in that direction. And so Joe Biden will go down in history as Genocide Joe. He will not he will not live it down, the blood from this horrendous chapter in human history.
Yeah, and to think Gaza was already virtually unlivable before this occurred, and now, I mean, from the beginning it was a trial, pushing people down, killing as many people as possible, and pushing people south, and then bombing that area. It seems like that was the trap all along. And what you speak of, I think, is so important. The context of this project of greater Israel, not just Israel as I think a lot of people think Israel is simply satisfied with Palestine and expanding on the territory. It is about expanding much farther than that, and Palestinians, of course, pay the highest price. But that's why this is often talked about regionally. And so, maybe before we move on, could you talk about how you've been viewing how the overall region has reacted to this? I know there was the Riyadh summit between the Arab states and the Muslim majority countries. And kind of what you intimate is that given that there are these complex interests that are fueled mainly by the United States, it seems to have caused huge divisions regionally. And I'm curious about your take on it.
Well, Jordan, from its foundation, its purpose was to absorb the movements of people from other places. The vast majority of the population in Jordan are Palestinian. So Jordan is playing a terrible role. It has intercepted rockets that were aimed to strike Israel. It has arrested around 800 people who protested outside the Israeli embassy just in the last few weeks. And it will absolutely, like King Abdullah after 1948, the original King Abdullah, who was eventually assassinated on the grounds of Al-Aqsa because of his work with the Israelis in the Nakba 1948 war, and his work with the British. And then you have the legacy of King Hussein, who in 1967 also betrayed the Palestinian and Arab and Egyptian cause by helping the Israelis secretly. The King of Morocco did the same in that war. And unfortunately, what we have now are those who still rule those countries, whether it's Morocco, Bahrain, you have, of course, Jordan, you have, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, the talk of will Saudi normalize with Israel? Saudi has normalized with Israel. Saudi Arabia has already normalized with Israel. When they used Pegasus spyware to hack the phone of Jamal Khashoggi, that showed you something, that in effect, Saudi Arabia was outsourcing its external intelligence functions to Israeli intelligence. NSO Group is an arm of Israeli intelligence, of Unit 8200. That's the basis that all of these organizations were founded by. Netanyahu's most world-changing policy was in 2012, as reported by Calculus Tech, to move personnel from Unit 8200, Israel's electronic communications surveillance unit, which spies on Palestinian electronic communications and then blackmails them on the basis of what they've got from them through that mechanism, to move personnel from there into private tech companies and to found tech companies. So, for example, with Facebook, they literally procured in 2013 an Israeli tech company called Anava, and it enabled them, and it was founded again by personnel from Unit 8200, it enabled them to spy on our phone use if we had Facebook, and it then informed their decision to buy WhatsApp. And so later Facebook had to really close down that spyware that it had purchased from Israel. But what that policy has done has integrated Israeli intelligence with so many different intelligence services in the region. So, for instance, you have a company called Celebrite. Get this. Celebrite, again, founded by alumni of Unit 8200 in Israeli military intelligence. Celebrite not only hacks phones for the British police, it hacks phones for the Venezuelan police, it hacks phones for the Pakistani police, and it even hacks phones, or did until the Ukraine war, for the Russian government. Celebrite has achieved a greater penetration of independent states than any other of these Israeli companies. But a company like NSO Group was delivering this service to Saudi Arabia and was hacking Jamal Khashoggi's phone. Saudi Arabia has already normalized with Israel. People are getting detained and interrogated for wearing a kufiya in Saudi Arabia. People are getting taken out of stadiums and matches for waving the Palestinian flag in Saudi Arabia. So let's be absolutely clear about what is happening there. In terms of the resistance axis in the region, what you have now is the United States imperiling itself to a further degree in countries like Iraq and Syria, and it is hastening its withdrawal from the region. And I'll tell you why particularly. China signed with Iran a plan to invest $500 billion in the Iranian economy over the next 10 to 20 years. Now, what happened after that? After that, China comes and speaks to Saudi Arabia and says, look, if you want deals with us as the world's #1 economy, as they are in many ways, but as they will be undisputed very, very soon, Saudi Arabia was told that they had to make peace with Iran and stop the war in Yemen. And what happened? They made peace with Iran and stopped the war in Yemen. After that, Saudi Arabia, because you have to understand that the mechanisms through which both the Lebanese and the Palestinians have been able to defend themselves in the region has been reliant on Iranian training and Iranian arming. That's a documented fact. Whether people like it or not, it's a fact. So when Iran was brought out of isolation, which the deal with China did serve to do to some extent, also it meant that the resistance factions were brought out of isolation. So it meant that Saudi Arabia accepted a delegation from the Palestinian Al-Haraka al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas. Yeah, it meant that Saudi Arabia made overtures to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, if you were to solve Saudi issues with Hezbollah in Lebanon, you would solve a huge amount of the problems which afflict that society, because there has been a cold and hot war in Lebanon across the last few decades between with the Saudis on one side, the US and Israel on the, with them against Iran, Hezbollah, and those that support Palestinian rights, you know, those that see the Palestinians in the camps of Lebanon as human beings. And ultimately, that has been the sharp crack in the region. Now, what this will do is make a state like Saudi Arabia have to try to somehow depict itself as less pro-Israel than it is. As we know, the Gulf did not choose the US side of the proxy war in Ukraine. They did not choose NATO's side. Yes, they maybe sent symbolic weapons shipments to Ukraine, but ultimately they chose the Russian side. What you're seeing now, though, is that Israel, as a vestige of European and Anglo-Saxon domination of the global South, when more and more clarity becomes clear, let's remember this also, that the United States, which their government represents around 360 million people, right? It designates Palestinian armed resistance as terrorism. Okay. The British government, which represents something like 67 million people, it designates Palestinian armed resistance as terrorism. The EU designates it in the same way. Japan designates it in the same way. Israel designates it in the same way. Okay. Altogether, that's less than 1 billion human beings. The governments that do not designate Palestinian resistance as terrorism, who are they? The government of Switzerland represents about 10 million people. Government of Turkey represents about 80 million people. The government of Russia, which represents many, many millions of people. And the government of China, which represents 1.4 billion people, 18 to 20% of humanity. The vast majority of humanity is represented by governments who do not designate Palestinian armed resistance as terrorism. UN Resolution 3246 clearly states any group of people exposed to a foreign military occupation have the right to armed resistance. The vast majority of humanity see themselves in the Palestinians as post-colonial subjects. Israel is imposing an unsustainable ideology on the head of Palestinian people, and more cruelty, fascistic cruelty on an industrial scale will be required to sustain Zionism. And that is running out ultimately.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.